Right, so welcome back to even more Murder Drones AU rankings. This is part 3 of my mini-series, so if you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, I would recommend you go check them out first to get an idea of how this all works. We are going to be mixing it up a little bit today though, as I've decided to include some written fanfics in this video, which is why it's taken so long for it to come out. These authors are insane and write far too much, but that does mean I have plenty to cover. Our choices of fanfiction today are Dying and Getting Over It by Seraphont, The Church of Null by Electrical Ink, and DJ the Finder by Blanter Dang. The latter two are primarily written pieces, and the former is a collection of comics. Since we have new formats for these AUs, I also need to update the format of my review, namely the art and structure category because, well, some of them don't have any art. Instead, this category will be renamed simply to Structure, and will focus on the readability of the work, the quality of the language used, and anything else you'd find on the marking key of an English assignment. But that's enough exposition, let's take a look at what you're all actually here for. The premise for Dying and Getting Over It is relatively simple. Taking place after the defeat of Sin in episode 8, Tessa's consciousness reappears inside the drone's shell that the solver used to inhabit, in essence transferring Tessa's consciousness from episode 5 directly into the end of the show. Unfortunately for her, this transfer was not a clean one, as she's lost access to the majority of her memories and is working with the other drones to get them back. Having been taken in by the Dormans, she's also infected with some sort of virus not linked to the solver, which is slowly damaging her systems. The story itself follows a slice of lifestyle, showing the main cast interactions with the real Tessa and them getting over the aftermath of the final battle. Every now and again though, we do get a flashback of sorts to the time at the manor leading up to the true version of events that we were shown the warped version of in episode 5. Plenty of hints are given as to Sin's compromised state, but nobody really seems to pick up on it, at least not significantly enough to investigate and attempt to stop the solver's scheme. But let's be honest with ourselves here, totally wouldn't have recommended this AU to me so many times if there wasn't something to do with Jay in it, and there definitely is. Once Tessa is reborn into her new drone body, her and Jay begin to have romantic feelings for each other, developing into a proper relationship as the comic goes on. We thankfully manage to avoid most of the weird stuff that typically goes on with a relationship where both characters are in bed together a lot, especially in the world of fanfiction, but there are several jokes made at the expense of this idea. Overall, there isn't too much for me to complain about regarding the premise itself, except for the fact that I really don't like romance in my murder drone stories. My biggest complaint is it took me a fair while to understand what the premise of the comic was, but that will be covered later. The comic itself is nice and cozy and doesn't try to bring too much conflict into the story, which is a refreshing change of pace from the canon. 8 out of 10. For the Church of Null, the premise is drawn from a few different parts of both the Murder Drones canon and other parts of pop culture. The story begins with the 6 drone cores that Alice had kept in an oven from episode 6. Having been dislodged during the final battle, the cores wake up and look for Sin, who they believe is actively still on the planet. After being told to kindly piss off by Jay, the 6 find their way into the often neglected storage area from the pilot and make camp there, hoping to find some trace of Sin in and amongst the drones that remain in the colony. Meanwhile, Uzi, N, and V have returned to the bunker after their victory to begin to settle back into somewhat of a normal life. Uzi's grand tale of her being the hero is about as believable to the average drone as Flat Earth Theory is, but that doesn't stop her from telling it over and over and over and over again. The main focus for these 3 in the story though is instead a new game that has been making the rounds recently, called Spectre of the Can, which is essentially a Luigi board, but instead of using a guitar pick, they use the remains of a John West can. The 3 get sucked down the rabbit hole of this game after playing it for the first time and seeing some ominous red eyes appear. They go through different methods of trying to get the spirit to reappear later until it presents itself to Uzi again as Doll and then tells them to go to the other side of the planet for a totally worth it surprise. Meanwhile again, a group of 3 normal worker drones, Chad, Tiffany and Brad, also decided to play this game in the aforementioned storage area where they thought nobody was watching. After being scared out of the place from some careful maneuvering by the cores, Brad drops his father's authentication card and is forced to return by himself, where he is then sedated and reprogrammed by the cores to do their bidding and aid them in finding Sin. To help keep him in line, the cores make up a false motive for Brad to work off of, saying that Sin was trying to free the workers of their limitations that were placed in there by the humans, giving him some hope of a better future when in reality they're just using him to get what they want. This sounds kind of familiar. Where have I heard this before? Nope, I'm gonna stop myself there, not getting political in this video about funny robot stories. Alright, back on track. I think you can see based off of my rapid fire summary that there is quite a bit going on with this story, and that is because it is the length of an actual novel. Seriously, I downloaded this to help me work easier and it's 155 A4 pages long, with a tiny font. I can't grade this fanfic badly just because of the sheer size, but by virtue of the fact that there is a lot for the reader to take in, it does become a little bit difficult. I think the actual process of playing Spectre of the Can could have used some more work, and the way in which the plot advances is a little bit too reliant on certain events, but I'll cover that later. For the most part though, it's pretty solid and the elements connect with each other quite well. 7 out of 10. For DJ the Finder, the premise is much more in the alternate department of these AUs, as it is essentially a retelling of the second half of the story with the inclusion of the character after which the story is named. DJ. We will delve much deeper into DJ in the character segment, but for now all you need to know is that he's Tessa's cousin and he loves V. After breaking into the Elliot Manor on the night of the Gala massacre, our new protagonist narrowly manages to escape Sin thanks to him having the fantastic idea of not running headfirst into the psychopathic AI. However, that does not stop Sin's takeover of Earth and his parents getting murdered because we need to establish a tragic backstory. While cowering in fear and trying not to die, DJ gets a radio message from totally the real Tessa to come with her in a pod to Copper 9, escape Earth and also find V. Now I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. At this point in my research for this video, it had already been a full week. I had just finished reading Church of Null and I had found out that I have another 75 pages of university level textbooks to get through this week. So when I read the next part of this fic and found out it was a cheesy romance scene between DJ and V, something I've gone on the record about not liking in Murder Drones before, well, I stopped reading it. I'm really sorry about this, but the rest of my review is going to go off of the opening chapters because I'm way too tired to do anything else. But from what I have seen, I can say that inserting new characters into a familiar situation is a classic way of designing AUs, but there isn't really anything all that special about this one. That being said, it's not bad in any way, so I think it's reasonable to give it a 6 out of 10. For the majority of the cast in Dying and Getting Over It, there really isn't much I can say. N, V, and the supporting cast act pretty much the same as they do in the canon. It's the three main characters in this comic where we start to see some change, starting off with Jay. The biggest change in regards to Jay's character is actually something that I had to infer from the comic rather than being told outright, and that is her choice to side with Uzi rather than Sin in the finale. As Jay has been welcomed into the colony properly in this comic and even lives with the Dormans, she must have had a change of heart after seeing what Sin did to Tessa's body. This lines up with the more caring and maternal version of Jay depicted in this comic, constantly looking to comfort Tessa and even having a more reasonable relationship with Uzi. Uzi has also been softened down in this AU, being much more lenient towards Jay and even being openly friendly with Tessa. Granted, this is mostly done in private, but the fact that it's done at all is a noticeable change in her character. She still has a pretty sharp tongue and isn't afraid to throw a few jabs out there, but it isn't done in a hostile manner like we see in the canon. This time it's done in a more playful and friendly way. She's also choosing to take on a sisterly role in helping Tessa adapt to her new drone body and in her relationship with Jay. Lastly, Tessa herself is obviously changed in the physical aspect, but the mental change is clearly present too. First off, Drone Tessa is a clone of the personality of episode 5 Tessa, not episode 6. She's much more childish, much more curious, and a fair bit less rambunctious and overpowering. She's often the secondary character in any scene where she appears, letting Uzi or Jay lead and being much more reactive to what they do. One thing that is retained, however, is her lack of an ability to ask for help with physical issues. She gets help from Jay regarding some of her mental state and talks to Uzi regarding Jay and their relationship, but continues to brush people off in regards to the virus in her body. We don't yet get to see what happens with this virus as the comic is still ongoing, but it's a similar issue to her sore wrist in episode 5. Overall, the general trend here is the characters made more soft and agreeable, which lines up quite nicely with the style of the comic. It's much more fluffy, much more slice of life than the canon, so having a more likable cast is generally a good writing decision. 9 out of 10. Church of Null has a lot of characters, so I won't be going into an extreme amount of depth on all of them, but I will try to do my best to cover the basics. First off, there are the 6 cores from the show, but we only really care about 3. William, Cynthia, and Navi. William is the most significant to the plot, normally a quiet and reserved type of character. He's the one who feeds Brad all of the bollocks that he's led to believe, and as such is the main source of communication between him and the other cores. He starts off doing this purely to get Brad to agree to do their bidding, but with time starts to genuinely believe his own lie, becoming obsessed with finding other workers in the colony that he could convince of this so-called truth to stage an uprising against the fundamentalist way of life in the bunker. Cynthia and Navi are the two that oppose this idea the most. Cynthia herself is totally infatuated with Sin, hence her choice of name, and as such cares little for this make-believe that William is going on about. She's willing to go along with it because it looks like it's helping to find the absolute solver, but that's not what she's in it for. Navi's reasoning behind this appears to be thinly veiled narcissism. She's the de facto leader of the group of cores and immediately didn't like the idea of William talking to Brad about something that she hadn't agreed with at the time. William also has a tendency to ignore Navi in favour of doing more research for his projects, which doesn't help their relations. The reason one or more of these drones don't split up from each other is the fact that they all realise that by themselves as cores they're pretty much useless, which is valid reasoning. The problem with this is they often tend to blend together and it's rather difficult to figure out which character is which. The problem is made infinitely worse by the fact that character voices in this fic are quite poorly done. Uzi and V manage to hold their own personalities quite well, but the rest of the cast fluctuates between the voice they should have and a monotonous explanative tone that I will discuss more in the structure segment. Since I mentioned Uzi and V before, let's move on to them and our boy N while we're here. As I said, Uzi and V hold their canon personalities for the most part, with Uzi intent on solving the mystery of the can, and V reluctant but following along mostly because she has nothing better to do. For once in an AU, N isn't getting traumatized here, and in the one scene we do see him by himself, he holds onto his canon character pretty well too. When he's talking with the other characters, he loses himself a little bit to the explanation, but for the most part, it's just plain old N. My biggest problem when it comes to characters in the Church of Null is with our worker trio, Brad, Chad, and Tiffany. Now, having stereotypical high school personas is not a problem. In fact, it's reasonably expected from the show given what we see in episode 4, but it makes their actions in the fic completely nonsensical. I'll give Electrical Ink Brad here because it is implied that he's been reprogrammed to do the bidding of the cause and explains why he's going along with their plan so easily, but Tiffany and Chad should be having absolutely none of this. 6 out of 10. As I've previously mentioned with DJ the Finder, the story is intertwined with the canon one. As such, the majority of the characters here are direct copies of their canon selves. That holds true for Jay, Tessa, and V. So as such, my main talking point here is DJ himself. Now thankfully, despite the common experience that occurs with characters of this nature, DJ is in fact not a Mary Sue. He's an arrogant, take-charge individual who doesn't listen to a word other people say, and he only cares about what he wants, and the fic makes this very clear to us. The most obvious way this is done is through the medium of Jay, who actively hates his guts due to his inability to follow rules and procedures, as well as a perceived threat that he causes for Tessa's safety. Tessa herself is more reasonable with him, allowing him to continue to break into the house, partly because she's so incredibly bored, and partly because she knows he isn't as well off as her, though he does seem to be doing just fine. When it comes to his love interest, it's kind of difficult for me to describe because the scenes where the two interact cause me so much cringe that I've already suppressed them to the furthest regions of my mind. Same criticism with the romance, but the rest of it is fine, and there's good consistency in the canon cast. 8 out of 10. Now for the structure of dying and getting over it. Oh lord. Right, so in the nicest way possible, the structure of this comic is fucking abysmal. Comic pages and Q&As are scattered all over the Tumblr page meant to act as its home, none of it's in order. In fact, I'm not even sure if there is an order to the latter half of the story, it's just a mess. It was hard enough to find a place where all of the content is together, and even then it's very difficult to actually read. And that's a real disappointment because the little snippets of comics that are held together tell their story really well. It would have been so easy to just compile all of these pages onto Webtoon or Twitter or any number of other websites, but they just didn't. Look, I sincerely hope I've missed something in my research and there's a better way to read this comic, but until I'm told about it, this gets a 2 out of 10. The structure of the Church of Null holds up much better than Dying and Getting Over It, purely because I actually know how to read the damn thing. The story is also set up in a pretty smart way, using elements of the 3 points of view to complement and foreshadow the others to make the whole thing appear more linked. That being said, it is not all perfect. The opening 4 chapters should honestly have been condensed into one because it's full of far too much description, very little action, and was honestly just kind of boring. That is resolved in the later chapters, but that doesn't make it any less of a problem in these 4. The other problem with the structure comes mostly from my place as a longtime D&D player, and that is the fact that the story feels railroaded. We're supposed to have a mystery to uncover here, and the cores are meant to have a difficult task of finding Sin in their poor state. With that said, everything that the characters try in this story just so happens to work, especially in the case of Spectre of the Can. We don't really see the trial and error that the characters have to go through to find the correct answer. At most, there is a trying to play for a while and nothing happening, before jumping straight into the thing that works. The story itself is still fine, but it would have been much more engaging and entertaining if we got to see the characters actually struggle. 7 out of 10. DJ the Finder is thankfully just as easy to read as the Church of Null is. However, where Null spends too much time describing things and doesn't have enough action, DJ goes into the complete opposite direction. This is a bit of a moot point because there's nobody out here like this, but if you read this story without knowing the events of Murder Drones, it would make absolutely no sense, because on more than one occasion there is writing in here that literally just says, remember that thing that happened in the show? It happens here too. This is not effective storytelling, and I think it goes without saying that it shouldn't be done, especially in your opening chapters where you're trying to pull the audience into the story. I understand not wanting to rewrite the entire Gala massacre scene, but just give us a little hint into the fact that it's happening to catch the audience up on where we are, rather than just pointing to a timeline and expecting us to be engaged. We also have a very low description to dialogue ratio here. At the very least, there should be more description than there is dialogue to help create a sense of atmosphere and complement the story, but that doesn't happen often enough. To be honest, a lot of the time I felt like I was floating through the void with the characters, and was only able to conjure up some images of where they were thanks to my obsession with this show. The dialogue itself is fine up until the part with V. The characters have good voice and are much easier to differentiate, but I'm still going to have to give this a 4 out of 10. So there's everything I have to say about these fanfics, now time for the final scores. Remember, the maximum possible score a piece could get is 30. Dying and Getting Over It finishes with a score of 19. We were doing really well in this one up until the structure segment where it got the lowest score in a category I have ever given out. That's really frustrating because what is there is good and the romance is surprisingly tolerable, but if the comic is hard to actually consume, I can't rate it very well. Next up, the Church of Null gets 20 for a slight edge on our first option. While it has a much better structure, there are still some pacing issues, and I find it hard to believe in some of the characters' actions, both of which lost at a few points. And finally, DJ the Finder manages 18 out of 30. The structure problems with this fanfic were less extreme than with Dying and Getting Over It, but they're still very much there, and the premise is a little bit weak, which both contributed to it having the lowest final score. Now, onto the final question. Would I recommend you read any of these? In their current states, I'm gonna say no. Now, if you manage to collect every part of Dying and Getting Over It and put it together, then I would say read that, but as for the other two, they are too long and too flawed for me to confidently recommend them. But that's all I've got for today. Thank you all for watching, and have a good one.